I'm going to be presenting today the Back to Basics of Construction Management, the May 25th section of the 6-part series. So some housekeeping before we go. Absolutely welcome your questions as we go through this session. As you can see on your right-hand side of your screen in your menu for GoToWebinar, there is a questions section. Domingo will be helping me in managing that questions section and let me know when there are and what the questions are. Now, more than happy to answer those. Feel free to put those in as they come up. If we can't get to them and during the session, we do have a section at the end to answer questions as well. So also today's webinar will be recorded and everyone will receive that in a follow-up email. All right. So the topic of today's Back to Basics webinar is managing multiple funding sources for public projects. All right, sure. Everyone on the call understands kind of how complicated that can be. So what we're going to be talking about today is kind of the basic functionality of eBuilder, why we do this in eBuilder, how we do this in eBuilder, and most importantly, what we don't do in eBuilder, right? To really keep this as a basic concept of what we're trying to do from a capital construction management perspective of managing funding in the eBuilder system. All right, so what are some of the basics of managing multiple funding sources, specifically around capital construction management, right? Who manages those funding sources, right? Private institutions, you know, there are a lot of different flavors of money, and I'm going to use that saying a lot today, right? It's basically all the different places where money can come from that funds your capital construction portfolios, right? So private institutions, public institutions, universities, public schools, local, state, local, federal government, they all use a great deal of funding sources in order to fund their capital construction portfolio. Those can come from grants, donations, bonds, taxes, stimulus endowments like the one we're getting ready for right now in our infrastructure industry. Different endowments, those can be yearly, those can be on 2-year rotations, those can be on 5-year rotations. A lot of different ways that we get funding in order to serve our constituents by building and utilizing those funds in our capital construction portfolio. So what are the challenges, right, that we see most often when we're talking to our clients in terms of managing funding? And I want to be very clear, this is managing funding for capital construction. So when we talk about the challenges, we are focused on the construction managers, the directors of construction, the line of business in managing funding, not necessarily the accounting, right, and finance teams who are usually managing funding inside of their ERP system to begin with, right? And we'll talk more about that a little later. But when we talk about it from the construction perspective, very poor reporting and monitoring, right? We don't really know how much money we have left, either in a source or maybe across all of our sources attached to a single project or multiple projects in a portfolio. There's a lot of ambiguity about when we're going to run out of money and when we need to ask for more. We have difficulty tracking the distribution ratios. I'm sure anyone who has done this before and has worked with funding knows that you can't just carte blanche spend, in many cases, not all, whatever you receive in funding on whatever you want. There could be project allocations, there could be sections of project allocations. It may be tied to very specific deliverables or very specific purchases. There may be reimbursables involved, right? All of that means that the money has to be spread out within the line items of how we manage construction contracts and construction invoices. In some cases, construction budgeting. And there's a difficulty tracking those distribution ratios. There are legal and compliance risks, right? Again, we're not just allowed in many cases to spend that money on whatever we want. So what are we allowed to spend it on? What funding can be used for what sections of the project? And if we have underutilization, right, or we've been overfunded, what are we allowed to do with that money? Can we use it on different projects? Can we use it on the same project but changes in scope? All of those things. And then that legal compliance risk kind of feeds into the auditing component of making sure and looking back that we did spend all of the money correctly at the end of the project or as we near the end of the project, or in the case of multi-year funding projects, as we go back to ask for more money, right, for future years for the continuation of the projects. All right, so that's really what we're here to solve and talk about today, right, is the basic components in eBuilder that allow us to do this in the terms of a capital construction portfolio, right? So let's move on real quick. Okay, so why is this important, right? Again, visibility, better reporting and tracking, right? Compliance, making sure that we're meeting those requirements and that we can show and detail that the money was spent in the correct allocations to the correct activities within the construction project. Avoiding those spending priority mistakes, right? When we talk about those flavors of money, there is a very clear priority of what money we want to spend first, right? In many local governments, I'll use that as an example, we want to spend the federal money first, then we want to spend the state money, then we want to spend the local tax dollars, right? In that order, and we want to make sure that we're adhering to those spending priorities as long as it's within compliance. Securing or maintaining future funding, right? Again, really important when we talk about programs that fund on, you know, if we look at something like DOTs that fund on a 2-year cycle, right, with a 5 or 10-year outlook, but we're only actually getting 2 years worth of funding at a time. So that constant interval of reporting of when we're going to need more funding and making sure that that funding need aligns with the current status of the project, right? Have we had change orders in this 2 years? Has the scope grown in this 2 years? Has it shrunk? And we need to look at other ways we can utilize that money over the 2 years that we've been working, and what adjustments are we making as we continue to ask for that funding as we continue to roll out that project. The need for tools to manage those funding sources, right? And let's kind of stop there for a second and talk about what eBuilder is doing in terms of funding sources, right, versus what we're not going to do. So when eBuilder talks about a funding source, right, that's our most basic term to a single flavor of money or a single allocation that's tied to one or many projects for a specific utilization purpose, right? Kind of complicated. So what does that mean? It means where we got the money from and how much it's from, what we're allowed to spend that money on, right? Whether it's one project, many projects, whether it's one phase of the project or many projects, or whether it's tied to very specific tasks or deliverables within that project, right? And putting that information in to create what we call a source, right? What we don't want to do is try and make eBuilder into an ERP, or how our ERP is managing funding, which could be GL counts, account codes, right, with actual accounts, where the money is coming from, right? All of those components we want to stay away from when we're talking about basic fund management in eBuilder. So we're looking at partially similar information, right? And this should be very familiar to anyone who's worked in a project management information system like eBuilder and compared how we manage overall cost in that system versus how we manage construction costs in an ERP system. They're looked at very, very differently, right? The level of detail that the ERP is going down to is far different than the level of detail that the construction management system, in this case eBuilder, is going down to, right? We're going to look at budgets, contracts, schedule of values, invoice line items in terms that make sense to construction managers, project managers, and the people actually doing the work, what we refer to as the line of business, right? The accounting system is going to look at it in financial accounting terms, right? So one of the big mistakes we see, and one of the things that we're going to note in this back to basics and we don't want to do, is to try and bring all of that financial accounting detailed information into the eBuilder funding module. It's a recipe for disaster, right? What we want to do is define what the source is in eBuilder, and that is in terms of what our line of business needs to report in terms of managing to and executing against the project against those funding sources. So let's talk a little bit about how we actually do this and what eBuilder's bringing to the table. So we have the ability to create clean, clear funding sources by project, right? Using flexible and easy naming conventions on the entry of the sources, right? We can easily compare that to the existing project budget and commitments, right? We have easy creation of rules to automate multiple funding allocations to specific commitments, right? And that's a percentage-based rule, right? I want to spend 50% of this money and 25% of this money and 25% of a third money. And I don't want to type that in every single time I want a contract. I just want to press one button and say, that's the 50, 25, 25 rule, and have that apply. Now, when we look at the top of the screen, we're seeing that concept of budgets versus commitments, actuals, right? Available funds, and then the projected over under of the project in this sample illustration. One of the first things that eBuilder funding allows us to do, and what we hear from our clients, right, is to differentiate between how much money I think the project is going to cost me and how much money I currently have to do work, right? And that's a differentiation between the estimate and the project budget versus the available funds and how much work I can do. And your organization may term that currently as the budget, right? That's fine. A lot of organizations that we run into when we say, what's your budget? It's what we have in the bank. Well, then what is what you think your project's going to cost? Well, that's the estimate, right? And where are you tracking that? We're not really tracking that right now. It's one of our pain points, right? By utilizing eBuilder funding, it actually allows you to track both of those in a single system. So I can track, okay, this is how much my project is going to cost day to day, and that changes as we move through the project, through the design phase, even into construction in terms of change management, right? Versus this is how much funding I have allocated to my project, how much money is in my bank account that I can write commitments, encumbrances, depending on what your organization uses, whether it's fully encumbered at the commitment or partially encumbered, again, organizational rules there, and how much has been spent against those encumbrances, right, and the remaining amount to spend before I need to go back and ask for more money, right? And this is a very simple but powerful tool right here on the screen. Do I have enough money to complete my project or the current phase of my project based on my expectations when I asked for that funding, right? Yes or no. And if that's no, right, now I know I'm going to run out of money before I complete my obligations. I need to go back and I need to put in requests to increase the funding, or I need to attach additional funding sources from those different flavors of money to the project because we've moved faster, or there's been change management, or our estimate was off, right, when we actually asked for the funds. So all of that information is kept right here in a very simple, easy to read screen that details what I have, what I expect to spend, and how much is in my bank account, right? And it's very simple to add these. By simply clicking one button, I can type in information about a funding source. I can create a source, I can create a description of that so that I can identify it, right? And then I can start attaching encumbrances to that source, right? Very, very simple. So we can do that at the project level, or we can do it at the portfolio level, right? And again, same concept, but what we're talking about at the portfolio level is maybe the allocation, right, or that funding source isn't tied to a single project. It can be tied to all of my current portfolio, right? And I'm still in compliance. So this allows me, again, to look at funding sources, create them just as easily as I was able to before, manage them and identify them just as easily, compare the current funds versus what's allocated versus what's committed against, right? But now instead of doing it in terms of a singular project, I'm doing this across my entire portfolio, which was, again, one of our pain points of not just looking at whether I have enough money to manage a project, but whether I have enough money across my entire portfolio and where I'm allowed to move that money in order to make up shortfalls based on gain deficiencies elsewhere, right? I don't want to do that in 17 different screens. I want to be able to look at that in a single location and go, oh, okay, I have enough in my bank account to meet my encumbrances. All right. And then the last thing we look at, again, to keep this very, very simple, right, is when we get down to day-to-day management, right, best laid plans, sometimes we have to be flexible. Sometimes we have to go in on individual line items inside of a commitment, whether that's the contracts, whether that's the invoice, depends again on your organizational setup, and determine how much money I want to spend on that line item and where that, or rather, how much of each source I want to spend on that line item, which source that's coming from, right? And again, I don't want to do this in 5 or 10 different screens. It can be very, very confusing when I'm going through and I'm having to click around, dive into one line, put in an allocation or a rule, dive into another line, put in an allocation or a rule, and not look at, okay, what's my grand total, right, of my funds available, and having to bounce back in and out of that. That's where eBuilder's ad hoc funding tool comes into play, right? So when I'm doing this, I'm seeing a combination, a simple application of all of my funding sources attached to the project by all of my line items attached to that contract, right? And I can go in and I can say, based on the details of this SOV item, how much do I want either as a dollar value or as a percentage, right? And carrying that through all the lines, doing it at the header level or doing it at the line item by line item level, right? And as we get into the detailed value of those SOVs, there could be 95% of the lines that are very, very simple and get into a rule, but then 5% of those lines get a little complicated because they deal with special endowments, and they deal with materials purchases that only specific funds can be used for. And this person building this hospital wanted a very big statue, which is these 3 line items, and these funds can only be used on those 3 line items. So I need a quick way of attaching those in a way that makes sense to a construction manager and a project manager of the type of money, the flavor of money, and the work that's being performed, right? And that's why you're not seeing that in most ERP systems, because they're not tracking information down to the SOV line item detail like we are in eBuilder. Right. So this is kind of going down to that last level from portfolio to project and now to the individual encumbrance, and how to manage funding very cleanly and efficiently without getting into a lot of accounting details that start to jumble up the specific job role and what we're trying to do within the system. All right, so before we open up the last 5 minutes for question, just a couple of testimonials that I want to come over from some of our more successful clients who are using eBuilder funding, right? GSFIC, Georgia State Financing and Investment Commission. Before they implemented the solution, right, they had a lot of these same challenges. PMs having to track multiple projects, would have multiple funding sources, and always having to calculate this out on a monthly or yearly basis, and trying to figure out, can I even write this check? Can we do this work? Or are we going to have a funding issue when we kick it over to the finance system and not be able to pay for work that's been performed, right? That's just a lot of stress on a project manager that doesn't need to be there, right? So after implementing it in these simple terms, they have visualization at the budget level, at the contract level, and of all of those different components on what all of their line item costs are and what that compares to their funding. And a lot of those controls are built into the system, so much so that it won't let them move forward with the invoice, even if they missed all of the other information. eBuilder will stop them and will say, you're writing an invoice that you don't have the money in your bank account to cash. So we need to solve that problem first, and then we can move forward with this invoice. A very, very powerful tool that, and it's always easier to solve problems on the front end when you know about them than on the back end when you've already sent it over the financial system and now we don't have money to pay for this. Again, this is a quote from a great user of ours, Jeffrey Eaton, the CFO out of New Mexico Public Schools Facilities Authority. Said, I think that for anybody who's in a situation where they've got to earn confidence and trust from a lender, a system like eBuilder is the kind of thing that helps your case. We require the use of eBuilder system to receive state funding. In fact, if we didn't have some kind of system to track those funds, we'd never gotten out of the gate with our first $50 million back in 2002, right? So again, as lenders, especially state and federal level, are handing out the money, they want a system in place to track that the money is being used effectively, right? They want a system to be able to detail more than an ERP system of, okay, this account code goes to this GL code to pay this check. That's not going to cut it for what was the money used for, what was put in the ground, what is serving the constituency that we allocated that money for, right? And this is what Jeffrey's talking about, that eBuilder solves that problem, and it solves it very, very cleanly. And a big part of this is as it's set up at the beginning of the project, and when you're setting up the budgets, when you're setting up the commitments and the encumbrances, it handles itself as it moves through the project, right? So instead of having to constantly manage this through the state of the project, eBuilder's self-managing for you, right, as you're moving through your normal workload of budgets, change management, right, and invoicing against the construction work that's been performed in the field, right? So again, Jeffrey covered a lot of it in the quote, so I won't read too much of this, but this is what we did for New Mexico Public Schools, the beginning and the end of that solution. And then the Caltech, California Institute of Technology. Again, this is where for a different type of institution, right, even private institutions and public school institutions, we still have flavors of money where we have to account for where it's spent, right? And it is accounted for, in their case, specific items on specific projects, right? So we're not even, oh, you have this much money from these sources to conduct the project. Specific endowments could be used for only specific pieces of technology or specific components in the construction that fed a need that grantor, right, that the person that gave that money felt was important, right? So being able to track and manage and budget to all of that was a great tool for them in allowing them to move forward with these projects and report on all of those commitments and endowments that they were utilized correctly. Right. So before we open up for questions, quick plug again. The 2022 Infrastructure Virtual Summit for Owners is June 1st. Ton of great information specifically on infrastructure covered in there. Absolutely, please register for that. I'd love to see some of the people that joined us here today in that item or in that session as well. And after that, we can go ahead. If there are any questions, we can open it up for those.
Yeah, Tali, so we do have one question, and it's in response to the Project A fund sources slide. The question is, are budget numbers and committed numbers autofilling from the project budget and actuals?
Absolutely, they are, right? That is happening in real time from whatever is happening on the project, right? You don't have to type that information in. So that comparison always gives you that information of, okay, this is my current budget, all right? And that's as current as your most recent budget change or your most recent change order or your most recent invoice application. It's a great question, Catherine. Okay. All right, well, if there are no other questions, we are right on time. Again, really appreciate everyone joining me today for this session. And thank you for your time. I hope it's been informative. I hope it's answered some of your questions on what we do in eBuilder to manage funding effectively and easily and not get out of our lane in terms of capital construction management, right, which is what we're here to do. Okay, thank you everyone very much.